Hello to you all, and welcome to the Holocaust research in challenging times, indeed challenging, an online conference of the Holocaust researchers. And we are in our second session of today. And the session title of ours is Memory Wars. I would like to add that the session will be recorded and upload to the internet. And to our speakers that will speak soon, I would like to thank in advance for making special efforts to stand in the limited time of 7 minutes. I know it's not easy. I also looked at the titles of the topics, and we're expecting a very interesting session. I would think I will speak in the name of us all, when I will thank my friends, my colleague, Baz Cohen, and Ronnie, Mikel Arieli, and Daniela Oselsky-Stern for organized this conference, and thank you very much. It's very important in those days to see that there is an alternative way to keep our research and activity. Before I will start with the first speaker, Baz, would you like to say a few words?
I already said opening words in the former session, but maybe for many of the Americans were still asleep. We are really delighted by seeing what is going on here. We have 87 people in this session and running. I mean, the counter is running up. In all, we had 260 people registering to the conference, which I think makes it one of the biggest Holocaust research conferences in the world, if not the biggest in history. What I would like to say is that we do want a discussion, but it is very hard to do a discussion with 87 people, or 90 already. So what we are asking you is to write down questions. As people speak, write down your questions, not comments, questions, short questions in the chat. And once the speakers will finish all, then we'll do several rounds of asking them your questions. I mean, the hosts will read out the questions and they will forward them to you. You can also see them by yourselves, but speaking and looking at the chat is probably complicated. So without further ado, let's begin, Tamir.
Yeah, and thank you, Baz. And also I would like to add that Ronnie will help me to collect your question, and of course we will have time for that at the end of the session. And our first speaker is Jonathan Zisook. He's a PhD candidate in the City University of New York. And he will speak about the Holocaust, Holocaust revisionism meets competitive martyrdom in present-day Poland. So the stage is yours, and I will stop sharing, and you will start yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share the screen. Okay. It's a pleasure to be with all you today, despite so much uncertainty affecting the world right now. In light of the time constraints, I prepared a short text, so do bear with me, but I promise it will be short and hopefully engaging too. In the aftermath of the 2018 Holocaust law, which outlawed discussions of Polish complicity in the persecution of Jews during the Holocaust, the Deputy Minister of Culture in the Polish government, Jarosław Sellin, proposed the creation of a quote-unquote Polocaust museum. This museum, according to Sellin, would tell, quote, the story of how the fate of Poles during World War II looked like, end quote. In other words, the Holocaust of the Poles, Polocaust. What exactly, however, does this term refer to? Often used by the Polish far right, the term Polocaust connotes a parity of suffering between Polish and Jewish victims and permits resentment of the international attention the Holocaust receives. One of the most audacious examples is the Warsaw death camp conspiracy theory. The story goes that there was a satellite camp of KL Warsaw, or the Gęsiówka camp as it is known in Polish, near Warszawa Zachodnia train station. In a road tunnel under the railway, 200,000 Poles were murdered in a converted large gas chamber. The problem with this account, of course, is that it is almost entirely fabricated. It was first developed in the 1970s by Maria Ciecinska, a judge who served on the government's main commission for the investigation of Nazi crimes, and has appeared off and on ever since, especially in recent years. Like many conspiracy theories, there are some elements of truth to this story. There indeed was a Warsaw concentration camp. It was established in July 1943 on the edge of the Warsaw Ghetto, where intern Jews, mostly from elsewhere in Europe, were transported to Warsaw from Auschwitz and were forced to clear the rubble of the ghetto after it was burned to the ground by SS Commander Jürgen Stroop and his battalions following the ghetto uprising. The camp was then liberated by the Polish underground during the Warsaw Rising in August 1944. In total, of the 8,000 to 9,000 prisoners at the camp, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 people, not 200,000, were murdered, almost all of whom were Jewish. Of course, as it should be evident, there were no gas chambers in Warsaw. There was a satellite death camp at Warszawa Zachodnia. The supposed ventilation shafts used to gas Poles in the railway tunnel turned gas chamber were, in fact, not installed until the mid-1970s. Even the conservative IPN, Institute of National Memory historian Bogusław Kopka, refutes the claim that 200,000 Poles were gassed in Warsaw by the Nazis. Yet, regardless of the historical facts, the myth of a massive death camp in the heart of Warsaw persists and has the tacit support of the ruling Law and Justice government and the director of the IPN, Jarosław Szarek, who previously promoted this conspiracy theory as a journalist prior to joining the IPN. What I would like to do now with my remaining time is briefly provide an example of how this revisionist conspiracy theory is perpetuated as a means of promoting the notion of a Polocaust. In October 2017, a commemorative plaque was unveiled at the Sanctuary of Our Lady Queen of Polish Martyrs in Warsaw, the church you see on your screen in front of you. The top plaque, also enlarged to its right, reads, "In memory of the 200,000 Poles murdered in Warsaw in the German death camp KL Warsaw in the years 1942 to 1944. During the unveiling ceremony, the plaque was sprinkled with holy water by a priest and saluted by an army officer who laid a wreath. This was followed by the singing of the Polish national anthem. During the ceremony, Andrzej Melak, a peace member of parliament at the time, gave a speech describing the plaque as, quote, living history which every Pole should know, end quote. You'll notice the location of the KL Warsaw plaque is directly above a 2014 memorial plaque to the insurgents of the Warsaw Rising on the facade of the church. The juxtaposition of these plaques is not random. It is, in fact, quite symbolically significant. The advocates of the Warsaw death camp conspiracy theory combine the supposed Warsaw death camp losses with the approximate 200,000 Polish victims of the Warsaw Rising to get to 400,000 Polish casualties in the city of Warsaw alone, roughly the same number of Jews forced to live in the Warsaw Ghetto, most of whom were exterminated at Treblinka. In so doing, the Warsaw death camp myth has become synonymous with the notion of a Polocaust. It is used to deflect attention away from the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust by highlighting Polish suffering, both real and imagined. And while certainly this convoluted mix of Holocaust revisionism and competitive martyrdom does not represent the entirety of the social and political landscape of Poland, far from it, though it is not marginal either. For example, the late Kornel Morawiecki, who was the senior marshal of the Sejm under peace and parenthetically the father of the current prime minister, he defended the controversial Holocaust law of 2018 by referring specifically to the notion of a Polocaust. Morawiecki declared, quote, "One cannot blackmail Poland when it comes to the Holocaust, since Poland had its own Holocaust," end quote. In conclusion, returning to the proposed Polocaust Museum, fortunately, such an idea seems to have been scrapped by the government for now. Shortly after declaring his intention to create the museum, the Deputy Minister of Culture walked back his comments, perhaps sensing that a Polocaust museum was too bold, even for the Law and Justice Party. Selin told reporters that, quote, "The Polocaust Museum will not be built because it would hurt Jewish sensitivity and unnecessarily provoke more tension between our nations," end quote. This is almost certainly true, but in walking back the museum, Selin still does not refute the notion of a Polocaust, which is entirely conspiratorial, revisionist, and rooted in a politics of competitive martyrdom, cynically employed for political gain, irrespective of historical reality. Thank you so much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Jonathan, thank you very much. It was fascinating, and I, of course, will go to the question in the end of the session, and I'm sure there will be. Our next speaker, Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming. She is the director of the Mandel Center in the United States, the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Suzanne, I'm very happy to have you here with us. And the stage is yours.
All right, I'm going to hit my share screen and share. I hope it works. And this is totally new for me.
Wow. Hi.
Okay, it's this one. Okay, excellent. I've done it. Okay. As my colleague said, this presentation is represents my views and not necessarily those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. No modern pope has been as scrutinized as Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. Soft-spoken, aristocratic, delicate, and trained in law and diplomacy, scholars have only been able to study Pius XII through Vatican documents up to 1939, the date of the end of Pius XI's pontificate. Sometimes called Il Papa Tedesco, the German Pope, Pius XII was enormously popular with the German people during his time as a papal diplomat to Germany from 1917 to 1929. When he became Pope in 1939, he controlled the worldwide Catholic Church and the tens of millions of Catholics in a Europe on the brink of war. The Vatican Archives, revealing his words and actions, have remained under seal these last 75 years, and in March 2020, these archives finally opened. We are talking about over 16 million pages in dozens of languages spread across multiple archives, separate archives, in Vatican City and Rome. Only 1.3 million pages are digitized. The rest are accessible in paper format. For scholars of World War II and the Holocaust, the archives of a special interest are the Vatican Apostolic Archive, or former Secret Archive, the ASV, now the AAV, the Historical Archive of the Section of Relations with States, the AES or AAEESS, the Archive of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the Propaganda Fide Historical Archives of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, the Historical Archive of the Congregation with Oriental Churches, and varied historical archives of congregations, dicasteries, offices, and tribunals. To adhere to my 7 minutes, I'm going to give just one example of a question that's loomed large in the historiography these last 75 years, the role of the Catholic Church in the so-called rat line. Gerald Steinacher's book, Nazis on the Run, 2011 National Jewish Book Award winner, carries a new importance and weight in light of the 2020 opening of the Vatican Archives for the 1939 to 1958 period. In this thoroughly researched book, Steinacher recounts and reconstructs the flight and escape routes of the Nazi perpetrators after 1945. He is interested in the circumstances that allowed them to do so, the routes they followed, and who helped them. Beginning in 1946, and with the help of the German-speaking population of South Tyrol, Italy became a highway for war criminals, a Reichsautobahn für Kriegsverbrecher, and South Tyrol in particular became an escape hatch or Nazi Schlupfloch. In addition to the International Committee of the Red Cross and American intelligence agencies, some institutions and administrative bodies within the Catholic Church played an active role, intentionally or unintentionally, aiding some of the most notorious war criminals and Holocaust perpetrators escape Europe under false names and identity papers. You will recognize their names: Adolf Eichmann, Franz Stangl, Josef Mengele, and hundreds, if not thousands, of others. What was the mechanism by which such men obtained identity papers under falsified names? In the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the AAV, researchers will find the records of the Vatican Relief Commission, or Commissione Soccorsi, founded in 1939 and under the supervision of Undersecretary of State Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Saint Pope Paul VI, canonized in 2018. This body was responsible for the care of prisoners of war and refugees. It distributed its work to national subcommittees to nationality of the refugees themselves. 4 such subcommittees were particularly active with regard to assisting war criminals: the Austrian Relief Committee, the German Ecumenical Aid Organization, the Croatian Confraternity of San Girolamo, and the Hungarian Relief Committee. These bodies verified the identities of prisoners of war and refugees in order to facilitate aid, repatriation, and emigration. Thousands of such forms that you see here from Gerald Steinacher's Nazis on the Run for Franz Stangl were filled out, most for returning prisoners of war and refugees, but also hundreds for war criminals and Holocaust perpetrators. What did Montini, the future Saint Pope Paul VI, and his superior at the time, Pope Pius XII, currently a candidate for sainthood, know about these activities? The answers lie in Vatican City. On Monday, March 2nd, 2020, the multiple archives relating to the pontificate of Pius XII opened, only to be closed again on Friday, March 6th, due to the COVID outbreak. I was at the gates of St. Anna 12 hours before opening, and then I had to return. It was heartbreaking. They remain closed at this time, but the study of history is a long game. These new archives will not bring an immediate resolution to questions about the rat line or other pressing issues. It will take at least 10 years and many scholars to carefully examine this massive archive. When they do, we may well have a revised narrative of the Catholic Church and the Holocaust. Likely, we will find a mixed record. Once we know what that record is, Catholics, Jews, and scholars around the world can really wrestle with it intellectually, and for practicing Catholics institutionally and emotionally as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. Can you stop share, please?
Yes, there you go.
Thank you. It was fascinating, the secrets of the Vatican, many more to expose. And Dennis Schaefer, I hope I pronounced it right, is a PhD candidate in Princeton University. He will talk about the revisiting the 1944 Theresienstadt, the commentary. Dennis, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I must apologize because I have connectivity problems, which is why I have to leave my camera off. That usually throws my bandwidth off. And thanks also so much for organizing this. It's giving me a terrific reason to buckle up and write, and I shall begin right away. The former ghetto, Theresienstadt, approximately equidistant between Dresden and Prague, is a central site in the history of the Holocaust and our remembrance thereof. As the German memory scholar Walter Schmitz notes, the present-day town of Teresien, which is the Czech name for Theresienstadt, constitutes an astonishing contradiction. I quote, "The contrast is stark. A jewel of the Baroque, not far from the Elbe, sits on one side opposite a place of remembrance to the victims of horror on the other," end quote. To wit, several cities co-inhabit, uneasily as it were, the peculiar cityscape of Teresien in northern Bohemia. There is the Baroque stronghold and the former ghetto, as well as the place of remembrance that came after it. However, there was also another city, another town that was once erected on the fundament of the stronghold and of the ghetto, yet that exists, as of today, only as a phantasm between the others. This other city, likened to a Potemkin village by those who wrote about it, is the image of Theresienstadt that the SS wanted to project onto their own site. It has now become some sort of necropolis, if you will, has an afterlife in the light show of the screen. In 1944, a group of cameramen was dispatched to Theresienstadt so that they could produce a documentary about an allegedly convivial habitat that the Nazis had erected there for the predominantly Jewish population of the ghetto. While most of this footage has been lost, some of it survived and became famous under the very ironic title, Der Führer schenkt den Juden eine Stadt. The Führer donates a city to the Jews. The actual title of the project was to be Theresienstadt, ein Dokumentarfilm aus dem jüdischen Siedlungsgebiet, Theresienstadt documentary from the Jewish settlement. Much of this history and of what this fake news documentary attempted to show and thereby falsify has been worked extensively by the historian Karl Markry. It is not my intention in any way to contradict this research with any new sources, not to add to this historical scholarship any contestation as to what the Nazis falsely attempted to portray. On the contrary, I rather wish to complement these historical approaches towards the film by looking at it from an aesthetic viewpoint. What are the visual strategies employed in the Theresienstadt documentary, and why do they matter? In the little time that has been given to me, I would like to walk you through the very basic visual strategy that underlies the documentary. I will not be discussing any of the more famous scenes. The meeting of the Judenräte comes to mind, or the concert that some of you may know, even though they are very interesting for who or what they show. Instead, I will exemplify this basic visual strategy, the nuts and bolts of the film, as it were, through a selective reading. But be warned, if you are looking for the aesthetic verve of a Leni Riefenstahl or the blatant anti-Semitism of a Veit Harlan, you are looking in the wrong place here. When I initially set out to analyze the materials, the biggest hurdle was the intense boredom that comes over you when you watch the fragmentary remains of the film. And it took me a second step to realize that this boredom is actually programmatic. This is not to say that there is not a horrific and concerning quality to the material in its playful and gleeful misrepresentation of life in the Jewish ghetto. Much rather, I would like to point out that the material proceeds in a limited set of conventional filmic techniques, cutting sequences that progress from long or panorama shots to medium shots to close-ups. In the interest of time, I will only be able to provide you with a few screenshots instead of showing you a whole sequence. This is one of these screenshots. And look at this panorama shot of some people on the walls of the stronghold. It is accompanied by a voiceover commentary that tells us, and this is my translation, everybody likes to spend a couple of hours of their spare time on the walls of the old fortress, end quote. The first of these panorama shots pans from left to right, and the second one, accordingly, from right to left. As the second pan finishes, you may notice these two elderly women that have come into focus, and I think they're doing some craft work. I don't know exactly what it is they do. And subsequently, we cut again and get to observe them up close. And that is indeed all that there is to it. Many a sequence in the documentary proceeds in such a manner to show the inhabitants of Theresienstadt at whatever everyday activity they could capture. You may wonder what is so special about this macabre and simple procedure, and why this conventionality constitutes, in my opinion, the key to the aesthetic makeup of the documentary. And here is why. The conventionality of this visual form, as it is put into place here, implies the conventionality, the everyday quality of the things that it wishes to capture, in a consistent accord with the descriptive voiceover that highlights not only what we see, but how we are to perceive it. The film creates a very dangerous visual continuum out of this limited, even overtly simple register of shots. This cohesiveness is so strong that it prevails even in the fragmentary nature of the remaining materials. To conclude, the danger of the material lies not in the outrageousness of its representation, even though it is completely outrageous, but in the simple and seemingly lucid manner with which its images are combined. Ultimately, this otherworldly Theresienstadt of make-believe reveals a surface that may not run deep, but whose aesthetic fabric we must unearth and indeed upturn nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Denise. Theresienstadt, fascinating story. I think one of the amazing words I heard was from a Theresienstadt survivor. She was asking if she's an Holocaust survivor, and then she said, yes, but sorry, I was only in Theresienstadt. Our last speaker is Dr. Charles Perrin. He's from Kennesaw State University. He will speak, his lecture is, the name of his lecture is, Did an Anti-Semitic Lithuanian Mayor Try to Save Jews? Jonas Šliūpas, conflicting Memoir and the Holocaust. Good luck, Charles.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Let me just give you a little bit of background to this presentation. Basically, I've written a biography, unpublished, of Jonas Šliūpas, and I'll tell you just a little bit about him, since this presentation is basically, it focuses on him. Well, he was born into a wealthy peasant family in Tsarist Lithuania, attended Mitava Gymnasium, that's basically in present-day Latvia, and let's see, he later studied medicine at the University of Maryland in the United States. He contributed to, founded or edited several Lithuanian newspapers, and became one of the leading activists in the Lithuanian national movement in the United States, where he spent 35 years living in exile. And his long life encompassed the rise of Lithuanian nationalism in both Tsarist Lithuania and the United States, the escalating tensions between Lithuanians and Jews in independent Lithuania in the late 1930s, and the first Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which was a critical turning point in the relations between Lithuanians and Jews. In his old age, Šliūpas served twice in the 1930s and briefly in 1941 as the mayor of Palanga. And Palanga is a resort town on the Baltic Sea. Now, before I have basically a short abstract of this presentation, which I'll read to you. But before I read this presentation to you, or the abstract to you, I just want to mention that my specialty is the history of modern Lithuania. My specialty is not Holocaust studies. This is something interesting. What I have is, I think, empirically interesting. What I have is purely empirical. But I really need help with the theoretical, linking what I have, the empirical part of my presentation with something more theoretical, because I don't have a background in Holocaust studies. And essentially, there are several areas where I think my paper, it is a paper, needs help. One has to do with the classification of people in Europe during the Holocaust into perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and rescuers. In the case of Šliūpas, his case seems to blur the lines between these categories, because he was someone who was praising the perpetrators at first, but within a matter of days, he was trying to, he had tried to become a rescuer. Another area where I think my paper needs help, in the case of one group of sources that I have, basically, Šliūpas gave an impromptu speech in Palanga as the Jews of Palanga were being rounded up by German soldiers and Lithuanian collaborators. I've been able to find 6 eyewitness accounts of this speech that Šliūpas gave and what subsequently happened to him. And there are significant differences between these sources, and the reliability of these sources, from my analysis, varies greatly. So if any of you know, can suggest sources having to do with the reliability of eyewitness testimony during the Holocaust, that would be helpful. And the third area, if anyone knows of any cases, other cases of an anti-Semitic rescuer during the Holocaust, that would something that would certainly help my paper before I publish it. So let me just read a brief abstract of my paper, and maybe I'll try to expand on it. This paper will critically evaluate the claim that Jonas Šliūpas, a Lithuanian who briefly served as the mayor of Palanga after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, tried to save Jews during the Holocaust. It highlights the hazards of using memoirs to write about the Holocaust in Lithuania, and demonstrates that even Lithuanians who sympathized with Nazi ideology could engage in selective resistance. The claim that Šliūpas tried to prevent the killing of Jews has been made in almost all biographical works about him, and several other works as well. First by Lithuanian Americans, and later by Lithuanians in post-Soviet Lithuania. This claim has its origin in the memoirs of Lithuanians who immigrated to Canada and the United States after the war, and is supported by the second-hand account of a Lithuanian Jew imprisoned as a child in Palanga who survived the Holocaust. Šliūpas' own wartime writings, however, make it clear that he welcomed the killing of Lithuania's Jews, who he blamed for all of the misfortunes that Lithuania experienced during the first Soviet occupation. Together, these two groups of sources suggest a more complex and unsettling reality. Šliūpas objected to the killing of Jewish children, who he tried to save, but welcomed the killing of Jewish adults. Now, how did I reach this conclusion based on these sources? Well, it seems that in Šliūpas's case, and I should mention, in the case of the Lithuanian Jew imprisoned as a child in Palanga who survived the Holocaust, I don't have his name, but basically he told this story to another Lithuanian Jew by the name of Nicholas Gemmel. And basically, this account includes enough detail to suggest to me that this is a reliable source, and it had it definitely suggests that Šliūpas was trying to do this. Exactly when is unclear, but it seems to be around the time that sometime after the male adult Jews and boys in Polonga were murdered by the German soldiers and Lithuanian collaborators. And it seems that his thinking seems to have been this, that it was wrong to kill Jewish children because they hadn't been indoctrinated into communism yet. Šliūpas, like many other Lithuanians during the first Soviet occupation, embraced the myth that all Jews are communists. But in Šliūpas's case, this applied only to Jewish adults. So it seems that from his perspective, it was right to kill Jewish adults because they had been indoctrinated into communism, but it was wrong to kill Jewish children because they had not been. So it's an interesting sort of morality that we find in his case. And I'm not sure how much time I've taken up so far, but I think I'm going to end there, and I can certainly go into more detail if anyone has questions or comments.
Charles, I want to thank you very much for your words. And I think we can come here to our first conclusion before the questions, that I wish that each one of you had more time to speak about their topics. And I can see that also from the numbers of the question in our chat, but we have another session later. Okay, so Ronnie will help me with a question, and we'll start with that. Thank you for all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Sure. So I join Tamir with the congratulations for great presentations, and we'll go directly to the question. So Anka asked I think it was Jonathan. It was a communist rhetoric to consider that all communists suffered during the Holocaust. The communist Jews acknowledged that the Holocaust affected the ethnic group of the Jews, because in Romania, there were moments where this truth was negated. Did the communist, sorry, just jumped. So the bottom line is, did the communists minimize the suffering of the Jews when they acknowledged it also in Poland?
Okay, thanks for that question. Of course, yes. I mean, yes, of course. And Isabel might also talk about this as well, referring to this question specifically at the site of Auschwitz. But yes, that's very obvious. I mean, just take Auschwitz for an example. It was preserved by the communists, by the Polish communist authorities. Of course, it took until the early 90s for there to be English and Hebrew signposts, which were written by a British professor. And of course, Jews were not really mentioned in the lists of the victims as far as their own specific specificity. Or you take many monuments throughout Poland, but elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe, where you have the victims of fascism, the victims of Hitlerite crimes, with no mention of Jews at sites where they were specifically targeting Jews. So it's a good question. I think it's something that covers a lot of terrain and is not exclusive to Poland.
Thank you. We'll take your.
Well, we have a question to Suzanne from Ella. What do you think about German scholars' article regarding attitude of Pope Pius, who was aware of mass murders?
Yeah, that article's really been making its way around the world, and just to give a little bit of context for the other listeners, there's a German team out of the University of Münster, led by Professor Dr. Father Hubert Wolf. The team of 7 researchers. They really do excellent work, and they were able to be there for those first 4.5 days of the archives opening. Professor Dr. Wolf, when he exited the archive on that first Monday, he met with reporters, and then subsequently this article detailed, he talked about a 1942 report that Pope Pius XII had received about the murder of Jews. And there are some other details in the article. So what's very interesting is actually, I think, I'm guessing that Professor Dr. Wolf was misquoted, because there's a set of 12 volumes called the Acts and Documents that the Vatican published from 1965 to 1981. And the document that actually several documents that this news report refers to are available in this 12-set series and have been available since 1981. I suspect the point that Professor Dr. Wolf and his excellent team were trying to make was this 12-volume series is not complete. And so while the report that was quoted is known and available in this ADSS series, some of the responses to it, and specifically the comments of the anti-Semitic comments by Delacroix, were not included in the 12-volume series. I suspect the point he was trying to make was we now have access to the whole series of correspondence back and forth. I think that in 4.5 days, we really can't draw any conclusions about any of it. And then there is a lot available to us that we have to sift through, and that team does great work. And there's a strong French team going in, a strong Yad Vashem team going in, there are US scholars going in, David Kurtzer's team going in. So we're all excited to work with each other and really get some non-sensationalist, non-headline answers, careful, scholarly, thought-out answers. But journalists aren't always quite as nuanced.
Thank you. So we'll have one question for Daniel from Karen. How would you contextualize or theorize further the subsequent reworking or reframing of the film, and what these interventions reveal about the tension between the content and form of the film? And Karen adds that she's thinking here, for example, of Daniel Blaufuch's project on Theresienstadt, in which he shows, he slows down the footage of the original film through a red lens.
Thank you, Karen, and also thank you, Roni, for giving me this question. I find these reworkings to be particularly interesting. For example, there is one I was in Theresienstadt last summer, and they also show parts of this film in 1970s artistic project that combines the footage with other artworks that were produced in Theresienstadt at the time of the ghetto, to sort of to create a very strong contrast between this convivial environment on the one hand and then the actual dire situation on the other hand. I'm a bit unsure on how to theorize these other projects, but I think when it comes to contextualizing the film within these appropriations, there were others as well. Sebald's Austerlitz comes to mind, for example, in which stills from the film are being used. I would definitely place them in some sort of a memory context, and the approach that I come from is usually more local. That's the Walter Schmitz that I've quoted, which looks at more local instances of remembrance in the case of certain localities. What does it mean to visit a certain place and remember it and gain some sort of memory from that? And I think it's interesting that the project, I don't know the Blaufuch project, so I'd really have to look into that. But I think it is very important to bear in mind that the tensions that we see and that people try to capture oftentimes puts something on the film. That means they bring in information from the outside. And what I'm trying to do more is to look at it in and by itself. So sort of looking at taking historical accounts or historiographical research, but really looking at the film in and by itself, because I think that can reveal, that would work most productively. But I will look into the Blaufurt project. This film has a very interesting afterlife that would be worth its own research, I guess. And I'm not yet equipped to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So our next question is for Charles. The Nazis repeatedly in official communications called Jews Jewish Bolshevik commissars. Do you think that your figure, the one that you're focused on, arrived independently at his idea that all Jews were communists, or do you think he could have been influenced by the Nazi party line? Charles?
Yes, thank you for the question. Hold on, I'm trying to see where there it is. Yes, well, in the case of Šliūpas, he does seem to have been influenced by Nazi propaganda during the first Soviet occupation. For example, in Memoirs that he actually composed in 1942, he describes World War II as a war kindled by Jews. Not only that, but in 1944, he published an article in a Lithuanian medical journal arguing for the killing of mentally and physically disabled Lithuanians. And also, I know in an unpublished work on the Talmud, he lists among his sources a German journal that discussed subjects such as euthanasia, mass sterilization, as it applies to Jews. So, and I should mention here, Šliūpas was fluent in German. So he does seem to have been influenced by German or Nazi propaganda during the war. However, his anti-Semitism has a much longer history. He was born actually in 1861. He was fairly old by the time that World War II took place. However, he seems to have been exposed to the traditional anti-Semitism that you find or you found in Lithuanian villages. And also in Šliūpas's case, what's interesting is that he flip-flopped during his life between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. It really depended on the context. For example, in the United States, he spent 35 years here. He had political ambitions, and his political ambitions made him realize he can't rely only on the Lithuanian immigrant vote, and he actually courted the vote of other immigrant groups, including Jews, when he was in the United States. And his anti-Semitic rhetoric disappeared during that time period. So I would not say that he arrived at this conclusion independently when it comes to calling Jews communists. See, there's another comment here. Should I go ahead and read this and try to answer?
Yeah, you can. You may.
Okay, comment. And this is from Anna. I don't know much about the Lithuanians, but I work with the topic of Ukrainian collaboration in the Holocaust and the role of Ukrainian nationalists in it. I have to say that we have to be very careful with the documents published by the nationalists, especially in the diaspora, because they tended to forge evidence and whitewash their crimes. Ukrainian nationalists, for instance, forged testimonies of Holocaust survivors who were allegedly saved by the UPA. Well, I can tell you that in the case of the source, which is a secondhand account of a Lithuanian Jew imprisoned as a child in Palanga who survived the Holocaust, this was published in a Lithuanian American newspaper called Draugas. It has a Catholic orientation. And let's see, more details about the source. There actually is an archive devoted to Jonas Šliūpas, which is in Šiauliai, Lithuania, and I visited it several times. And there actually is in the archive a letter that the author of this article, which was published in Draugas, wrote to Vytautas Šliūpas, who is one of Jonas Šliūpas's sons, in which he describes this event, but in less detail. So to me, it's very unlikely that there would both be a forged letter in this archive and also this published article in Draugas by Nicholas Gemmel. But when it comes to the Lithuanian diaspora, they were definitely engaging in selective remembering and forgetting. This is among the Lithuanians who basically retreated along with the German army in 1944, wound up in DP camps, and then later emigrated to the United States, Canada, and Australia. Some of them stayed in Germany. This is very clear because, for example, Šliūpas' immediate successor as mayor of Palanga, he was actually removed by the Germans. He was forced to resign. His immediate successor immigrated to the United States, and for example, the Lithuanian Americans published a multi-volume encyclopedia in the 1960s. There's an entry for this particular Lithuanian. I think his name was Naburas. And in the entry for him, which was probably written by Martynas Nobaras himself, he doesn't mention that he was mayor of Lithuania mayor of Palanga in Lithuania in 1941, basically when the mass killings were taking place. It's, he left that out. And, when it comes to motivations, Lithuanian immigrants to the United States who had collaborated in, atrocities during the war had an incentive to cover this up, because if they had actually stated that they had been, affiliated with some sort of organization involved in atrocities, they wouldn't have been allowed to immigrate. If they had become citizens, they could have been stripped of their citizenship and deported. So it's that, they had that incentive to engage in forgetting when it comes to collaboration.
Thank you so much. Charles, we'll try to have another round of questions. Tamir, is it okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Great. So a question from Tom Friedel to Jonathan. The case of KL Warsaw is, of course, absurd, as you rightly point out. But more broadly, I wonder how much of the comparative martyrdom was born of the fog of war itself and from less cynical motives. For example, Wendy Lower and David Furber have argued that the general government was the site of two ongoing genocides, the Jewish and the Polish, but were implemented at radically different paces. Any thoughts on this aspect of German policy?
Okay, thanks for this question, Tomasz. This is of course true, but I would say that given the context in which there's been a recent rise in discussion around this so-called Polocaust theory, which is ostensibly all came after this 2018 Holocaust law. So while it's true that there's a historical origin to this type of thinking, which far predates the present, its prevalence today is situated within a very specific political context, which I tried to briefly draw out. but I would not contest your larger, broader point. So thanks for that question.
Two questions to Suzanne. One is from Daniela. You mentioned a number of teams that are planning to go into the newly opened Vatican Archives or have already gone. Do you have a sense of the particular research questions that these teams are attempting to address at the archives? Or is it more that teams are going into survey what is there? And another question from our Yaron, do you expect any new insight to be revealed about the Ron Colley's rescue activities, which could be embracing for the Vatican authorities? Is it okay?
Yes, yes. And forgive me if you hear little feet running around. I tried to get everyone to... I'm going to answer Yaron first, I think. So Ron Colley was a nuncio or papal diplomat in, I'll be really embarrassed if I get it wrong, Turkey, yes? And he issued papers to rescue not only Catholics baptized as Jews, but also practicing Jews who had no intention of converting. There were other nuncios or papal diplomats who did this. I think the central question is, one of the central questions is going to be, did Ron Colley have the blessing of the Secretary of State Maglione and the Pope Pius XII to do this? Was he acting on his own? Was it learned about and was he reprimanded? Or was he told on the quiet, okay, do everything you can, we just can't officially tell you it's okay? And those are the kinds of questions that we just don't know the answers to yet. Honestly, we don't know whether the Vatican will have reason to be embarrassed or celebrated. I think it's a moment to, as much as we all wish to rush to judgment, we really are going to have to take years and years. The 16 million documents, dozens of languages, 7 or more archives spread out around Vatican City and Rome. It's going to be a massive undertaking. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the first question?
Yeah.
Start to, and then I'll remember.
From Daniel, okay. You mentioned a number of teams that are planning to go into the newly opened Vatican Archives. Are they searching for something specific or just general?
Yes. So the French research team we're very much in touch with a former Mandel Center fellow, Nina Valbusquet, who is now in Rome, and she's a French researcher based in Rome for 2 years or 3 years, I think. She has a wonderful fellowship there, not with us, with I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, so I won't try. But she's very involved, and actually there have been 3 really big conferences already in France, precisely to that question of, when we finally get access, what are researchers around the world going to want to know? What do we already know? What did all the work of the scholars before us and those who worked in these 12 volumes tell us, and to be prepared? At the museum, our Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust is going to organize something this summer to try to gather questions like that. We're going to be working with the Yad Vashem next year on early findings as everybody goes in. And I think some of the bigger questions are the rat line. That's certainly one. And what did Pius XII know? When did he know it? When the Roman Jews were deported? That's a big question. What was the policy in Poland? Why was Pius XII so silent about Poland? And what was the correspondence back and forth there? What was the position of the Vatican with regard to Croatia? Pavlik is a very prominent rat line escapee. There's a lot of questions, and those researchers interested are very much in touch and trying to aggregate and all work together collaboratively.
Thank you very much. Ronnie?
I think we have another question for Daniel from Atina Grossman. I'm not sure that if she's still here, but I'll ask the question. The close-up offers a very different picture of emaciated and the ill elderly women than the pan shots of sunbathing. How does this work with the intent of the footage?
First of all, the name's Dennis, not Daniel.
Sorry.
No, don't worry about it. Yeah, I think that I think this is something that we need to, this discrepancy that has just been noticed is something that we need to be aware of when we look at the quality of the film. That means that the film is riddled with many imperfections. There is, for example, one scene where you can clearly see a ladder and a camera showing like just in the background somewhere. It's when we're doing the soccer game, which is another, I think, quite well-known sequence. And in that sense, I would say, yes, there are some, it is, I've argued a lot in my paper for a cohesiveness of these fragmentary materials, but this cohesiveness, which is what I should clarify here, is more in with regards to its formal elements. So how is this done formally? What is being shown sometimes is very seems disjointed in a way that you see these women who might appear a bit sick. There is, I think there was an enormous selection going on. Not everybody was shown in, like there was a very conscious effort to show only very recent arrivals or people who appear healthy and not starved. Even though if you look closely at clothes, for example, you can see that many people are wearing clothes that have become far too big for them, either because they have lost considerable weight since they got to Theresienstadt, or because they did not belong to them initially. And I think, yes, I think these contradictions in the material these are indeed there. And I think I should just refine my point that this cohesiveness is formal in the sense that it's always this strategy that I've outlined. It's always long shots, medium shots, close-ups, and then a bit of variation, but usually following this procedure. And I think this was done to cover up exactly those imperfections that were just being pointed out, that you may not notice, and that you have to watch it again and again to then pinpoint and exfoliate them.
Thank you very much. I would like to say a few words, and then maybe Ronnie will say something about our next important session today. So first of all, I would like to thanks personally to the speakers for very interesting topics, to Jonathan and Suzanne and Isabel and Dennis and Charles. Thank you very much. And I heard Professor Dina Porat said once that you have to move away far from the huge mountain and to see it clearly. And you can see from the first session and this one, the variety of the topics and the huge academic work in our field, and it's really amazing. So thank you very much for the speakers and for all the questions. I guess we could stay here for a long time. We have another session later, and Ronnie will talk about it.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I joined Tamir with the blessing. It was an amazing panel. And we will meet again in 1 hour for the keynote lecture by Professor Yehuda Bauer. And it will be chaired by Daniela. So please join us in 1 hour and 5 minutes so that you'll have 5 minutes to organize. And see you then.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.